Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College presents Liberty Mail with the Student Fellows of Faith and Freedom.
Welcome back to Liberty Mail. I'm Katie Kenline, and today I'm very excited to have with us Dr. Paul Kengor. I'm here with the Institute for Faith and Freedom. We're in studio today to talk about communism, some things that are happening with Russia. We're at the 2-year anniversary since Russia invaded the Ukraine, and very grateful to have Dr. Kengor with us, who is the Senior Academic Fellow here at Institute for Faith and Freedom, has written many books, including one of our favorites is The Politically Incorrect Guide to Communism. Do you have any initial thoughts? Here we are 2 years after, hard to believe, after Russia has invaded Ukraine. Any thoughts about where we're at in the world now?
Sure. Yeah, well, good to be with you, Katerina,
Thank you.
As I call you.
It's my full name, yes.
So her full name, and I love the full name.
Thank you.
But yeah, so we're at the 2-year mark of this invasion. So February 24th, 2022. And I remember the morning that it happened, and I was awakened by somebody who was texting me and calling me, and somebody who doesn't usually call me, actually, so he'll usually text. And I thought, why is this guy dinging my phone, right? What's going on here? What's happening? And so I stopped and I put on my glasses and I read the text message, and it said something to the effect of, the Russians invaded Kiev, right? They've invaded Ukraine, which was a shocking thing to see. I mean, the Russians, they've been... the Soviet Union in 1956 invaded Hungary. That was what was considered then a Warsaw Pact country, right? That was 1956. They invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. And then the only country they invaded outside the Warsaw Pact, Soviet Union, would have been Afghanistan, 1979. Yeah. So going forward, like post-Cold War, there's been problems, invasions, and things they've done with the Crimea and Ukraine, 2014, for example, other things that Putin has done. But we didn't think he would do this. He gave a speech in April 2005 to the Russian Duma, kind of like a State of the Union speech. And there he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That was a shock, right? Yeah. And so everybody thought, well, what does he mean by that? And I spent about 3 weeks on Russia in my comparative politics course here at Grove City College. I've been doing that since 1997. And so we talked about that speech then. We talked about it, every semester we talked about Russia after that. And I would say to the students, Putin's an old Russian nationalist, KGB. He kind of longs for the days of the glorious fatherland, as he calls it. And maybe the guy would like to reunite parts of the old Soviet Empire, but maybe he'd like part of the Crimea and Ukraine, but the guy's not going to invade Kiev, right? That's not going to happen. But he did it. He actually invaded Kiev. So the question of, we would debate in class, how much of Ukraine does he want? Maybe just Crimea, maybe Eastern, maybe this part, maybe that region. But he doesn't want, to go into Kiev. Well, now we got the answer. He wants basically all of it. Yeah. He would take all of it. And as he said in the very illuminating interview with Tucker Carlson, which a lot of people have been critical of Tucker for that interview, the best thing that Tucker did in that interview was got Putin to talk for 2 hours, right? And he made clear there, and for any American Putinists and defenders of Putin who've tried to defend him, that he really sees Ukrainian territory as Russia's territory. He also made clear that he thinks that World War II was started not between Hitler and Stalin, which it was, but by Hitler and Poland. Hitler collaborating with Poland, of all things. He used the word collaborate a couple times, cooperate a couple times. Crazy. But so we've really learned here that Putin is much more aggressive than I think anybody ever realized. And I wrote early on, in fact, I have a documented record of it because I've written so much on it.
Yes.
But in March 2022, that expect the Russians to get beat up on the battlefield because they always do terribly in armed conflicts. The only reason that they ever persevere is they have some dictator who's willing to feed hundreds of thousands and millions of Russian boys into the battlefield meat grinder. So they eventually persevere because they have so many people. And in this case, 2 years in now, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal in December And it was actually a report that was shared with Congress, originally secret, but some of it got leaked.
Yeah.
Where the Russians have lost, I don't know, 315,000, something like that, battlefield deaths since the war began. So they've lost an enormous number of people. And will it stop Putin? It's slowed him down, but he gave a speech at the start of this year, his New Year's Eve speech, where he said, we will be victorious. We will not back down. The Reuters translation of that speech, he said, we will never retreat. We will never retreat. So to me, it's all very ominous, and I fear to think what he could do next.
We continue to see like Western backing of Ukraine and a lot of support. There's stuff out about EU support for Ukraine continues to be very strong and everything. And I think then watching across the Atlantic in the U.S., I think a lot of times people don't know exactly what's going on. And I think maybe that Tucker Carlson interview was kind of opening some windows for people. But what do you think is important for Americans to be seeing, like with all the conflict that continues there? With I think a lot of people raise why do we continue to send? There's a lot of debate over sending funds to Ukraine, but I do think it is a refreshing perspective to hear you say that there is possibility for Russia to lose. There is. I think we don't hear that as much here about all their losses. We hear more about threats of nuclear weapons and things, this fear, the ominous lurking kind of Russian, which is very reminiscent of a Soviet.
By the way,
power.
I think Putin's capable of that, and I've written a number of pieces where I've talked about different Russian officials using the N-word, right, nuclear. Right, and in fact, as we're speaking right now, Dmitry Medvedev, who was elected president in 2008 as Putin's successor, he was talking just a few days ago about nukes once again. And Medvedev is the guy who. So, by the way, this tells you a lot about Putin in and of itself. So Putin is elected in 2000. So he succeeded Boris Yeltsin, right? And then he had 2 term limits, so he's supposed to be out by March 2008. So he kind of steps aside. His prime minister, he becomes prime minister. Dmitry Medvedev becomes president. And then 2008 to 2012, they start flipping this reconfiguration of power. And Medvedev is the guy who was sitting across from Obama in the infamous open mic moment. And Obama said, I will have more flexibility after the election. And Medvedev said, good, I tell Vladimir. Right? I tell Vladimir. And that was 2012. And then after that, Putin found a way to flip all of this, make himself president again. And here we are, 2024. He was supposed to be out in 2008. And he's guaranteed to be in power until probably at least 2030, basically as long as he lives. So, but increasingly, Medvedev and others have talked about nuclear weapons. And I just have this fear, this kind of sense that this guy, I call him Mad Dog Putin, right? There's this story that Rebecca Koffler talks about in her book on Putin, about he is a young man in an apartment building, like Soviet-era apartment building, being cornered by this giant rat, right? And the rat terrifying him. And then the next time he goes back, right, and he's vowed he'll never back down again after that. I just have this feeling, this fear that defeated on the battlefield, realizing that he's not going to defeat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, but wanting to annihilate or take Ukraine maybe by any means necessary, that he could do something really drastic, like resort to nuclear weapons. And some people see that maybe as me kind of fear-mongering a little bit, but I don't know. This guy is really bad, and they continue to talk about nukes. I think he's fully capable of it. I really do. I really do.
That's very interesting. I think, and then the other thing that we saw, which immediately people start to think he's also fully capable of other things. Political persecution was one of them. But this week we saw, Russian dissident and opposition leader Navalny had died in a gulag, which immediately tons of questions, obviously, about how he died, if he was killed.
Crazy.
What are your thoughts on that? Even the fact that he's in a gulag that was built back during some of what we would say are the darkest moments of Soviet history, Russian history.
Right.
But then here we are today, and it's still being used
That's
for
crazy.
about the same purposes.
The polar wolf penal colony, right? I mean, it sounds like a movie from the 70s or 80s, right? You picture scenes of Dr. Zhivago, right? Snow everywhere. I mean, this thing is like on the edge of the Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
This is like literally Siberia, the Gulag, right?
Yeah.
And people ask, well, why would you build a prison camp out there? They build them out there so you can't escape. Because if you try to escape, you'll die from the elements. You'll freeze. So they put him out there, and they put Alexei Navalny, who was Putin's primary opposition leader, who Putin already tried to poison. And Putin's been poisoning dissidents for 20 years. Alexander Litvinenko, polonium poisoning, polonium-210 poisoning. That was around 2006, 2007. He's an example of that. And so Navalny is out there, and he was clearly. I mean, they clearly killed him. They obviously killed him. I mean, no one should doubt that. And there was a piece just a couple days ago, I think I read it on Monday morning, about the body of Alexei Navalny. And they're not going to release it to the family.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And they skip the normal process of the morgue and the autopsy and everything else, and use the phrase like he died of sudden death syndrome or something like that, right?
It's so clear that we can see. Yeah.
Sudden death syndrome, comrade. Yes, right. I mean, it's so Soviet, right? It's so KGB-like, and in fact, that's what Putin came from. He was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, and by the way, they excelled in the art. The Russian word is dezinformatsiya, disinformation. So they specialized in disinformation, misinformation, lies, propaganda. So they will say and do anything to eliminate their opponents. And this comes to just a few months, I guess more than a few months. It would have been, July or August last summer, that the leader of the Wagner group, Prigozhin, who had led the counterinsurgency, looked like he was going to go try to remove Putin, right, but got cold feet and backed off, and then eventually goes to Putin's buddy in Belarus, Lukashenko, for protection, I guess. Yeah. And then he flies out, and he's in the sky, and at like 20,000 feet, his airplane, bomb goes off. You can see the video of the thing, circling down, smoke coming out of it. Can you imagine that kind of a death?
Yeah.
And so Putin is making it clear to people that you don't mess with him. And that is a sign. Saddam Hussein did this. Stalin did it. And people might ask, well, what good is this, him killing his opponents? Isn't this going to make people in the West even more suspicious of him? It's a sign to people within that you don't challenge him. You don't mess with him. That if you try to be his opposition leader, Navalny, if you contemplate a coup against him, Prigozhin, right, from the Wagner group, you'll be liquidated. You'll be eliminated. It's like right out of the old Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, and then that's what there's some letters out recently published that Navalny wrote to another former Soviet dissident. I don't know if you know Natan Sharansky. Like, if you want to touch on him before he wrote a famous book that Navalny ends up reading in prison last year, and then writes some letters. But they're letters.
By the way,
I
can tell you who he is.
Yeah.
So that's an amazing story. So Natan Sharansky, who was originally Anatoly Sharansky, he was in Gulag something number 10. I can't remember the exact name. I should know it. I started talking. I think I probably interviewed him for one of my Reagan books.
Wow.
By email. It wasn't in person, but he's the famous dissident who, when Reagan gave the Evil Empire speech, March 8th, 1983. And Sharansky's captors come up to him in prison, and they pull out a copy of Pravda, right, the Soviet newspaper. And it says, look, here's your Reagan, right? He calls us an evil empire, right? Here's your man for peace, saber rattling, right, causing division, calling us an evil empire. Look, here's your Reagan. And Sharansky talked about how he got that, read it, and as soon as his captors left, started jumping up and down for joy and tapping out in Morse code on his cell. Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And then the next guy in the cell hears it, starts tapping it to the others, and pretty soon, all through the Gulag, in Morse code, right, it's saying evil empire. It's like calling out its name. And when he was one of the people who Ronald Reagan, when he would meet with Gorbachev at the Geneva Summit, Reykjavik Summit, Moscow Summit, Reagan would keep inside of his jacket pocket a list of Soviet dissidents. And he would say, and this is real presidential leadership, he would say to Gorbachev, I know we're still hung up on this issue, SDI or whatever, but here's my list of names. Yes, I know your list of names, Gorbachev would say. Do you think maybe you could just do something to get one or two of these guys out? And one day Sharansky's prison door just opens.
Yeah.
And they said, you're free. You've got a close friend in Washington. And he met Reagan at the end of Reagan's presidency. He gave this beautiful statement about, think of people like me. So yeah, that's Sharansky. So he's somebody who was in the Gulag himself.
Yeah, and so
Navalny wrote a letter to him?
So last year, these letters are published in the Free Press now, and we'll put a link below. But last year, Navalny wrote a letter saying, I've read your book while I'm here and during my time here, and this part really stood out to him. So he says, in the preface of your 1991 edition, you wrote that dissidents in prisons have kept the virus of freedom, and it's important to prevent the KGB from inventing a vaccine against it. Alas, they have invented it. But in the current situation, it's not them who are to blame, but us, who naively thought there was no going back to the old ways. And for the sake of good, it's okay to rig elections a little bit here, or influence courts a little bit there, or stifle the press a little bit over here. These little things and the belief that it's possible to modernize authoritarianism are the ingredients of this vaccine against the virus of freedom. Wow. So
that's a great virus for freedom. So Reagan spoke of what he called the infectiousness of freedom. And he said Gorbachev's problem with glasnost was he didn't realize that the freedom is like leaving the genie out of the bottle. Once you let it out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. Gorbachev didn't understand the infectiousness of freedom. So once it spreads, you can't contain it. You can't pull it back. So that's probably a kind of a reference to that. And it's interesting that Navalny would have reached out to him. Vladimir Bukovsky is another who died fairly recently. So he was a dissident who ended up living in exile in Britain. And Bukovsky was the Soviets put him in a mental institution. This was a common thing with dissidents. So they would if you were against the Soviet system and protesting communism, it was like there was something mentally wrong with you, right? You do not understand what's good for you, right? What, are you crazy? Are you insane, right? So they would put you in an insane asylum for being against, their utopian communist ideology. So Navalny has, a lot of company for what he went through. Unfortunately, in his case, Vladimir Bukovsky survived, Natan Sharansky survived, Alexander Solzhenitsyn survived. To show just how bad Putin really is, Navalny didn't make it out alive. Putin had him taken out. He was young too. I think 47 years old.
That's what.
A wife, maybe two or three kids.
Wow. And I think the interesting thing in here is talking about. He says we didn't think it would be possible to modernize authoritarianism.
Right.
And I think that's what you've been talking about. That we see, unfortunately, not so distant past, maybe, or not so far off from the Soviet Union. What connections do you think that you see between rising authoritarianism, the communism of the past, what we still see today?
That's a good phrase that he's using, because Putin, it's really hard to explain, but he's not a Marxist-Leninist, right? He's not a Stalinist. He's actually not a communist, right? But he was trained by the KGB, brought up in the Soviet system, and he looks back at the glory days of like the Soviet motherland, this greater Russia. In a way, he's kind of a throwback to the czars, right?
That's interesting.
And although he is more a product of the Soviet Union than the czars, no question about that, but he's an authoritarian. I remember when we had the late, great Richard Pipes, who was the Harvard professor of Russian history forever. And we had him here at Grove City College, I think it was April 2005, and he spoke at STICT. And I remember that date because I used his book in my Marxism course, and when I open it up, there's a dedication to it, and I always see the date as like April 2005, and he wrote a nice note to me in it. But he and I kind of debated, and I said, I was actually optimistic about Putin. And he said, oh no, he said, I have no optimism. He said I was, with Yeltsin and everything, it looked like we could have democracy, but instead Russians are going right back to the days, not of communism, not of Stalinism, but authoritarianism. And I said, no, are you sure about that? He said, yes, they've gone right back to authoritarianism. And Pipes even made the case that he thought this was kind of within who Russians are, that they're kind of a people born to and have kind of accepted authoritarianism. By the way, Solzhenitsyn accused Pipes of racism for that.
That's
I remember
interesting.
Pipes telling me, he said, oh yeah, he accused me of racism. He was very angry with me when I said that. And he said, but I'm not saying it as a racist, right? And by the way, Pipes was Polish and Jewish. He said, I'm saying it as a student of Russian history. There's something about the Russian people. They live in trenches. I remember him telling me that. And they just have this thing for authoritarian strongmen. Now, even that having been said, I don't think that if there was a free and fair election, they would not elect Putin right now. I mean, Putin's got to be the most unpopular guy in Russia, sending all these young men to their graves. But now they have no choice because he's configured things and has such a noose, a grip on power, that I don't think he's going to be able to be removed.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I wonder, because there's some similarity, it's not exactly the same as exactly what we saw in the Cold War or anything, but what we all love that you are our esteemed professor of political science, but also you're known as being the Reagan scholar and Reagan expert here at Grove City. Is there any Reagan wisdom or advice that you think would apply to this moment? I mean, it would be really interesting to hear. I mean, many people who've been in foreign policy in the past, but their takes on the current situation we have.
Yeah. So Reagan said a million things about communism, right? And I've said that Putin's not really a communist. But Reagan said this about the Russians. He said the Russians respect strength, not weakness. And he said, we learned a long time ago that if you were going to approach the Russians with the dove of peace in one hand, you had to have a sword in the other. They respect strength, not weakness. And I knew Reagan's closest advisor, Bill Clark, really well. He was like a grandfather to me. I was his biographer.
Yeah.
And I often hear him saying in my ear all the time, like when Navalny died, I could hear him saying, Paul, that's Russian. That's so Russian. When I saw Prigozhin's plane spinning out of the sky, I could hear Bill saying, Paul, that's Russian. That's Russian. They just have this kind of savage way, a lot of the leaders do, of dealing with people. It's a really brutal place. The number of people that have died in Russia, they lost the most people in World War I, World War II. Alexander Yakovlev, in his Yale University Press book, A Century of Soviet Violence in Russia, says that Stalin alone killed 60 to 70 million people. They had the numbers on abortion in Russia, 7 million abortions per year throughout the 1970s. Just shocking. So it's this culture of death, death, death.
Yeah, low view of human dignity.
It's crazy. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we at the Institute for Faith and Freedom, Grove City College, Ronald Reagan, Reagan's close partner, Pope John Paul II, they talked about the communist lack of respect for the sanctity and dignity of human life.
Yeah.
And you certainly see that with Putin. And I think we need to understand that in dealing with Putin. He doesn't think the way that we do, which is why I'm telling people that as crazy as it sounds like the guy, I think, has a potential of using nuclear weapons. They say, well, what good would that be? There's such a low regard for life that I could see him doing it. By the way, if you play that out, if he were to use a nuke on Ukraine, maybe out of retribution, anger, or whatever, I don't think Putin would expect us in turn to nuke Russia. I think he thinks he could get away with it. Because if we were to do that on behalf of Ukraine, and why would we? Ukraine's not a NATO member. Right? Then we would be vulnerable to the Russians hitting us.
And depending on our leadership, I mean, right now,
Right.
who knows what the Biden administration would do?
So I think Putin could see that as a calculated risk that he could get away with. And I would warn people about this too. And this is why it's so crucial to stop Putin in the Ukraine. If he gets beyond Ukraine and gets on the border of Poland, if Poland gets involved in this, and Poland's a NATO member, then all hell breaks loose. Then you really do have the potential for World War III. And so a lot of what we're doing right now, the Biden administration aiding Ukraine and us sending a lot of money to the Ukraine, is to stop him in Ukraine. It's like a post-Cold War form of containment. Contain them there and don't let them get beyond that area. So it's worth it to stop them there before it spreads elsewhere in Eastern Europe, especially into NATO countries like Poland.
That's interesting. And even to use the word containment in our day and age,
Right.
it makes me think of different ways that containment would need to be. I mean, when we see rise of students, people my age, kids who are full, and they will say, you know, I'm in support of communism or I'm in support of socialism. There's almost some different containment in terms of these people need to be educated on the dangers of what's happened before, the dangers of authoritarian power, communist power, socialism. It's interesting. And that's why, I mean, I'm grateful to be here at this school and to be able to receive an education that's not indoctrination of that will lead us back into these ways. It's scary how he says how easily, the thing he says, for the sake of good, it's okay to rig election a little bit here, or influence the courts a bit here, stifle the press a bit over here.
Yeah.
It's interesting, the day and age we're in now, feeling like maybe we're not so far away that we thought we were so advanced beyond the Cold War.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, the more you break away from Christianity and that understanding of the sanctity and dignity of human life, that people who believe that we're not made in the imago Dei, in the image of God, then the more that they could trample on people and feel they get away with it. Reagan had a phrase, peace through strength. And so he said, there have been X number of wars in my lifetime, and you don't get into wars by being too strong, right? The idea, what's the Latin phrase? Si vis parabellum, if you want peace, prepare for war, right? And that doesn't mean you want war. The phrase, if you want peace, prepare for war. For deterrence, right? Peace through strength. So approach the Russians with a dove of peace in one hand and a sword in the other. Not Obama with a bouquet of roses in the other hand, right? All more flexibility after the election, right? Dove of peace in one hand, sword in the other. They respect strength. They've always been that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed this, and I one of my favorite things just to read, and I feel like is a great influence on what we need in our culture now, is to read Evangelium Vitae. Evangelium Vitae.
It's a great John Paul II encyclical on the gospel of life. That's an amazing document.
And I think it's interesting we see the continued threads of dignity of life throughout all kinds of issues in culture.
Right. Yeah, he and Reagan really bonded on that in particular.
Yeah.
In fact, he even sent Reagan a copy of that. And you could see the similarities in their thinking about, indeed, that phrase, sanctity and dignity of human life, which is so alien to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And we'll have some links below this video with all kinds of wonderful resources we've referenced today, because I know our audience will really enjoy this episode. Next week, Grace will be, she's going to CPAC in Washington, D.C., and so she'll have some content for our listeners and viewers there. But thank you all for joining us today, and be sure to like and subscribe.
Good job, Catalina.
Thank you.
For more information on the Institute for Faith and Freedom, visit faithandfreedom.com.